program says that I'm going to talk to you about some chapters in my life. I think I can do that. And I'm going to start with some stuff that you can't read on Wikipedia. So I'm an actress, and I've known I wanted to be an actress since I was 7 years old. There was a woman in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C., who every summer would turn her one-car garage into a tiny little theater. And then she would round up all the kids in the hood, and she would dress us in old costumes, and she would teach us to lip sync to musicals like Fiddler on the Roof and The Sound of Music. The other thing she would do is living portraits. And at 7 years old, I was cast as the girl in a living portrait tableau of Mary Cassatt painting The Girl in a Straw Hat. So I remember standing behind the tiny curtain in the dark, wearing a gray frock and a straw hat, and I was listening to the audience laughing and talking on the other side of the curtain, just a few feet away, and my heart was pounding out of my chest, and my knees were knocking so badly I didn't know if they were actually going to hold me up or if I would just fold like a deck chair on the Titanic. And in that moment, I knew I had two choices. One, I could run off stage in terror, and when the curtain opened, the stage would be empty. It would be a bummer, but no big deal because I was 7. Or two, I could hold my ground and face my fear. The deciding factor was that even at the age of 7, the idea of running off stage felt like a much greater failure than holding my ground and being squashed by any potential unmitigated humiliation I might endure. So I held my ground. When the curtain parted and the spotlight hit my face, my knees stopped knocking and my heart stopped pounding immediately. And I thought to myself, oh, that's the light. I need to be in the light. Though my victory was short-lived because my knees started to tremble as soon as the light started to fade, I had already learned in that 1/2 minute a very important lesson, which is, it is not necessary to be fearless in order to be successful. It is only necessary to have enough courage to temporarily overcome your fear. And this was really good news, because 7-year-old me, who was shy and fretful on the outside, had been plotting world domination for 2 years already on the inside. And even though I didn't really know how I was going to make that happen, I now knew that it was entirely possible. So over the next several years, I did lots and lots of school plays. And the ritual was always the same. I would cry for a week straight before each opening night, and then I would bring the house down as soon as the lights came up. I never had any acting lessons, so I don't really know how that happened, but it just did. Maybe because I wanted to be the best at everything that mattered to me. I wanted to exceed, to face my terror each and every time, then I would do it. So at 14, I started to work professionally. I was at a dinner theater outside of Washington, D.C., and I played Tinkerbell in an unauthorized musical version of Peter Pan. Let me set the scene for you. There were usually more people on stage than in the audience. As Tinkerbell, I was bigger than all of the Lost Boys, all of whom were girls. Peter Pan was a single mom. Captain Hook was an accountant. And there was a character called the Neverbird, who was this cross between Big Bird from Sesame Street and the Abominable Snowman, who was this 6'4" gay man who could recite MGM's film version of The Wizard of Oz in its entirety. And these 3 adult actors were also the waiters during intermission. So you can imagine that intermission was a pretty sweaty affair. As Tinkerbell, I got paid $50 a week, though my paycheck started to bounce shortly after I was hired. The production was also being sued by the J.M. Barrie estate for plagiarism. Yet somehow, the rumor backstage was that we were headed for Broadway. This was really good news, because that was totally part of my plan for world domination, so I was all in. One night, after about 4.5 months, my mother drove me to the theater, and it was all boarded up. On the front door, there was a note from the IRS next to one from the health department. So apparently the theater was bankrupt, as well as unsanitary. But nobody had bothered to call to say, you don't have to come to work tonight. nobody ever called. And what I remember about that time in my life was that I was, of course, incredibly disappointed, but I was undaunted because I had already had a very clear picture in my head for several years of what my success would look like. It would be global, enduring, and award-winning, of course. Not that I had a step-by-step guide as to how I was going to pull that off. I just figured I would do what I had always done. I would keep looking for the light. And 3 years later, I found it again. So when I graduated from high school, I had not actually gotten into college. I had applied to Vassar, Northwestern, and Yale. And when I tell that story, people always say, well, God, Yeardley, why didn't you have a school to fall back on? And I always say, because I might have fallen back on it. So 4 days after graduating from high school, I auditioned for a musical comedy review at a good theater in Washington, D.C., and I got the job. I went on to get these amazing reviews in all of the local papers, including the Washington Post. No, these were reviews like your mother would write. So that led to another job at a better theater, and then another, and then a theatrical agent, and then New York City, all in 2 years. After being in New York for only a month, I auditioned for legendary director Mike Nichols. He was directing Tom Stoppart's new play called The Real Thing, starring Jeremy Irons and Glenn Close, and I was auditioning to play Jeremy's daughter. It was one scene, one spectacular scene, and I got the job. Only to find out that the job was not actually to play the part, but to understudy Cynthia Nixon, who was playing the part. Oh, no. This was not part of my plan for world domination, so of course I was outraged. But my new agent said to me, you're going to sit down and shut up and pay attention, and you're going to take this job. And luckily I can be reasonable. I am willful, but I can be reasonable, so I did what she said. And it's a good thing because 3 months after The Real Thing opened on Broadway, Mike Nichols pulled Cynthia out of the play, put her in another play, and I took over her part. If I cried for a week before opening in school plays, you can only imagine the deluge that preceded my Broadway debut. Now, I shed so many tears I was like my own weather system. But when the lights came up, I nailed my scene. And I even got exit applause when I left the stage. The thing I wasn't prepared for was the curtain call. So that when I went on stage by myself, in my yellow t-shirt and my little gray miniskirt, my knees were knocking so badly I seriously thought I was going to collapse. And no matter what I did, I couldn't get them to stop. And I was mortified. Unbeknownst to me, there was a much sought-after Los Angeles agent sitting in the third row that night. He was actually there to scout Cynthia Nixon, and he'd seen her performance the night before, and the only reason he was there that night was because my New York agent had said, you have to see Yeardley before you make your final decision. His name was John Kelly, and John always says that my performance was great, but it was my knees knocking in the curtain call, the thing I was so embarrassed about, that convinced him he had to take me instead of Cynthia. So now that I had an LA agent, I traveled to Los Angeles for pilot season, and I immediately got a pilot. It didn't get picked up, but it didn't matter because I got a movie, and then some more television, and then another movie. I moved to Los Angeles permanently, and the successes continued to pile up without stopping for the first 14 years of my career. Oh yes, and 2 years after being in LA, I got a voiceover job I didn't even care about, playing an 8-year-old girl named Lisa Simpson on an odd little cartoon called The Simpsons, on a new television network called Fox. Of course, the owner of that new television network now owns half the Western world. And that odd little cartoon is now, at 26 seasons, the longest-running primetime television show in U.S. history. And Lisa Simpson is still 8. Now, despite my success, I was no less afraid of everything. Afraid of letting myself down, of letting everyone else down, of everything and everything. But I had read a book that said you should behave as if you already have everything you want in order to get it. So in desperation, I decided to behave as if I weren't a total control freak, but instead that I was a rather carefree and spontaneous soul. I adopted the motto, "Screw it, let's do it." And to my surprise, I totally got off on diving into the deep end of the pool, blindfolded with one arm tied behind my back, just to see how strong a swimmer I was. Which brings me back to those pictures that I talked about earlier. So as I said, I am blessed and cursed to get these very, very clear pictures in my head of what I think my success will look like. I've been told it's a blessing because it's rare to get such pictures. The curse is that for the longest time, I attached to every detail of those original pictures, and I left no room for change, so that when they didn't turn out perfectly, I felt like I had failed. Let me tell you a story. In 1992, I, along with 5 other actors, was awarded one of the first ever voiceover Emmys for my work on The Simpsons. Now, prior to that year, voiceover performance wasn't even eligible as a category for the Emmy Awards. So it's important for this story to know that the voiceover Emmy is given out at the Creative Arts Ceremony, which is where they honor the editors and stuntmen and costume designers, all the people behind the scenes. And this ceremony takes place a week before the televised Emmys, known as the Primetime Emmys, which is where all the other acting categories are honored. So in 1992, I was on The Simpsons, and I was also on a television show called Herman's Head, where I was in front of the camera. I wasn't the star of that show, but my character, Louise, was very popular. So I had been asked to present at the Primetime Emmys along with the actor who played Herman. As I walked down the red carpet, not one person in the press line asked me what it had been like to win one of the first ever voiceover Emmys the week before. It was like it had never happened. So I decided that meant that my award didn't count. And when I got home, I put it in the closet for the next 9 years. So I don't tell you that story so that you'll feel sorry for me. I want you to be smarter than me. The moral of the story is, welcome those pictures of your success, but do not attach to the details of the pictures of your success. So in 1992, I was 28 years old, and already an 11-year veteran of show business. So in any other profession, things should start to get really good right about now. But in '93, Herman's Head was canceled. I still had The Simpsons, but with the Emmy debacle and the fact that voiceover was never part of my original snapshot for achieving my dreams, I mistakenly placed very little value on it. '93 was also when I divorced my first husband after only 2 years of marriage. By '96, my on-camera career had all but ground to a halt. And for the first time in 14 years, I found myself out of the light. And I had no earthly idea how to get back in it. I began to feel pretty sorry for myself. I did. But I dragged my butt out of bed every day anyway because sitting still was far, far worse. For the next 8 years, I tried a number of different ways to create work for myself, which you have to understand was completely foreign to me, because I had always been the girl who just went to the audition and got the job. I had never, ever had to start from scratch before. And yes, I resented it, but trust me, nobody else felt sorry for me. So I did plays in Los Angeles for no money. No, seriously, no money. I wrote an autobiographical one-woman show, which I performed off-Broadway and in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, by the time the New York Times wrote that every girl in America should see this show, it was too late. We were broke and had to close a week later. I fired my agent, John Kelly, after 22 years. I hired new agents, and 6 months later, I fired them too. I got married again. I took a creative writing class and decided I wanted to write a young adult novel. I didn't know anything about young adults or writing a novel, but so what? I had my motto, screw it, let's do it. And so I plunged in head first, per usual. The book was called I, Lorelei, and it was published by HarperCollins in 2009. I was proud of it for so many reasons, but first and foremost because I had finally, actually, successfully learned how to create work for myself. Unfortunately, despite excellent reviews in the New York Times and Publishers Weekly, the book was a commercial failure. In the end, HarperCollins offered to sell me the last 1,200 copies at cost. Finally, I decided if I couldn't get a job in front of the camera, I would go behind the scenes and start producing movies. As usual, I didn't want these films to just be vanity projects where I just put up the money and didn't do any of the work. So I plunged in head first and learned everything I could about being a good producer. Honestly, I found the job kind of boring. But I figured it was just me, so I tried a second film, and then a third, and this last one was a pretty big deal. It was called Virginia, and it starred Jennifer Connelly and Ed Harris. I had high hopes for it, but the production was fraught with delays and disagreements, and things didn't go too well. After dumping a shed load of money into the film, none of which I would ever recoup, and spending 3 months in the coldest, wettest fall in Michigan since 1995, I could no longer deny that I found producing tedious, unfulfilling, and too much like the 8th grade with money to be my cup of tea. So the year is now 2010. I'm 46 years old, and a divorce from my second husband has recently brought me to my knees. I am exhausted and depressed, and I've lost my ability to see my achievements for what they really are, because the outcomes are so different from the original pictures I've been carrying around in my head for decades. And whether or not I was being fair to myself, I now felt like a failed producer, a failed wife, a failed author, and a failed actress. So I know I said I didn't really know how to fix things after I landed on my ass in 1996, but this time I really didn't know. And then an out-of-the-blue question on a flight home from Michigan changed everything. So I was with a friend who had co-produced the movie with me, and maybe because I was being such a lousy travel companion and he just wanted me to cheer up, he asked me, apropos of nothing, "What are you passionate about, Yeardley?" And without hesitating, I said, "Shoes." And he said to me, "Well, why don't you have your own shoe line?" And I looked him in the eye and I said, "All right, I will." And a week later, he introduced me to a guy named Ben Cornwell, whose expertise was actually in apparel, not shoes, but never mind that. The first time that I met Ben, I brought in 40 pairs of my own shoes and 80 swatches of fabric. And I proceeded to tell him how I would reinvent the women's shoe. I said I wanted to be beautiful and comfortable because that's the one thing I don't have in my closet, and that seems stupid to me. I can tell you that miracles do happen because Ben was intrigued enough by my enthusiasm to want to help me. Never mind the fact that I didn't know the first thing about making shoes, and neither did he. Never mind the fact that we had no connections, and I had no design experience. Never mind all that. I had my motto, screw it, let's do it. And so my shoe company, Marchez-vous, was born. Marchez-vous means you walk in French, so that seemed perfect to me. Now I tell that story because until I started Marchez-vous, I didn't realize that my true talent in life, my true talent, is gathering the best, smartest, equally passionate people into my orbit and getting them to drink the Kool-Aid with me. Ben now runs my company. Do you see what I mean? So Marchez-vous launched in 2011 with a small collection of 8 shoes, all made in Florence, Italy. So sure, we were the new kid on the block, but I was so excited to show the women in the women's shoe industry what we were all about. Beautiful, comfortable shoes. Well, it turns out the women's shoe industry is run by men. Mostly straight, white, middle-aged men. What? I mean, one assumes that they're not test driving the product like we are, right? Though I suppose one should never assume. These men did not welcome me with open arms, but they also didn't clear a spot for me on the playground, so to speak. They did have a few things to tell me. They said I would fail. They said I would go broke. They said I shouldn't waste my time on making beautiful, comfortable shoes because nobody really wants that. And then they asked me, who's the real designer at your company? Now, if I hadn't been in show business for 30 years, where the odds are constantly against you and people say no 90% more than they say yes, I might have listened to those men and swum back to shore. But instead, their no sounded like go to me, so I let that be the gasoline on my fire. And this means that I used my celebrity like I had never used it before. It turns out, a lot of people want to talk to Lisa Simpson. I lured more of the best, smartest, most passionate people into my orbit, and I got them to drink the Kool-Aid too. I trusted my instincts, even when people said I shouldn't. And when in the middle of the night, I was overcome with fear and doubt that those men in the women's shoe industry might be right about me, I remembered that they don't know me. That success is only limited by my imagination. And finally, and most importantly, that joy has always been the truest indicator that I'm on the right path, and therefore, this must be the right path. Today, Marche Vous is sold in over 45 high-end boutiques around the country, and we're growing. The press loves us. Without fail, whenever I go to one of the shoe stores that sell our shoes, I meet extraordinary women of all ages who often tell me that they haven't been able to wear high heels for years, but now they own 4 pairs of Marche Vous and they're so grateful. But if you ask me what I'm most proud of, it would be the culture at my company. As soon as we stopped working out of my house and moved into real offices, I had 4 rules painted on the back of our front door. They are: 1, have fun. 2, learn something new. 3, ask for help. And 4, have fun. Today, people ask me for advice. What sort of advice could I share with them about how to start a business of their own? And what I have found is, by the time they ask me that question, they already know the answer. They have already Googled the how-tos and spoken to half a dozen people who do what they want to do. So the question isn't, how do you get started? The question is, what are you waiting for? No, think about it. I mean, if all of the tools are already laid out on the table, then why haven't you started to build the house yet? And the answer is almost always fear. So I guess my advice is simple. Get some support around your fear. And then step into your light and get ready to grow, learn, fail, learn, reach, try of your life. Thank you.